face stares back from the darkness, not hostile, not heroic, but wrong. Not wrong in the way of injury or age, but wrong in the way a rule has been broken. Bone presses forward where it should retreat. Flesh sags where authority expects symmetry. The mouth never quite closes, as if even silence has been denied permission. This is not decay. It is inheritance. Power has bent biology until biology has begun to protest. History prefers statues and banners, but it always leaves its clearest signature on the body. Empires announce themselves with borders. Consequences announce themselves with deformities. There is a paradox at work here, cold and impersonal. The more completely power is hoarded, the less capable it becomes of sustaining the vessel that holds it. Control concentrates. Options vanish. Systems close. What survives is not strength, but strain. This is the rule that governs dynasties long before they learn its name. Power that refuses to circulate does not harden, it distorts, and distortion is not a flaw, it is the invoice. The House of Habsburg did not begin with a face like this. It began, as most disasters do, with something modest and forgettable. A rocky outcrop, a wooden fortress, a name barely worth remembering. In the 13th century, Central Europe was not a map, but a noise. Territories overlapped like bad handwriting. Authority dissolved 5 miles from any castle gate. Law existed only where someone could enforce it before sunset. This was not an age that rewarded vision. It rewarded endurance. The Holy Roman Empire, if it could be called that without irony, was an argument pretending to be a state. Princes looted trade routes. Bishops ran toll scams. Armored men with titles no one respected kidnapped merchants and called it taxation. The throne at the center of this mess had been empty long enough for people to forget what it was supposed to do. That vacancy mattered. Because when power structures rot, the people who benefit most are the ones least interested in repair. The 7 prince-electors who controlled the imperial crown were not searching for salvation. They were shopping for safety. A strong emperor would end their fun. Order would cost them revenue. Law would interfere with theft. What they needed was a man impressive enough to be legal and insignificant enough to be harmless, a name without weight, a crown without teeth. They needed weakness that could be trusted. They found it in a Swiss count whose greatest crime was surviving too long. Rudolf of Habsburg was not born for legend. He was tall, awkward, aging, and underfunded. His castle was named after hawks because there was little else around worth naming. His lands produced goats, not armies. His lineage was noble enough to pass inspection and obscure enough to avoid envy. At 55, he was already an anomaly in a world designed to kill men young. To the electors, he looked like a compromise. To history, he looked like a test. What they failed to understand was that survival is not passive. Men do not simply endure violent centuries by accident. They learn. Rudolf had learned patience, reading rooms and timing. He understood something his betters did not. Power is not seized. It is invited under false pretenses and then quietly rearranged. He offered no speeches. He offered marriages. Before the crown was secure, his daughters were promised, not symbolically, practically. Voters became family. Opposition became awkward. The crown landed not with a conquest, but with a handshake and a wedding contract. When the electors realized what they had done, the paperwork was already binding. The harmless count was now the father-in-law of the empire. Weakness had been weaponized. Once crowned, Rudolf moved quickly, not loudly. He identified a rival who made the mistake of being obvious. Ottokar of Bohemia was rich, arrogant, and accustomed to obedience. He laughed at legal claims. He laughed at the crown. He did not laugh at the coalition that formed behind it. Rudolf invoked imperial law like a blade hidden inside velvet. When battle came, it was not heroic. It was efficient, A flanking maneuver that violated chivalric fashion ended a king in the mud. Austria changed hands, permanently. That moment mattered less for the land it gained than for the lesson it taught. War worked, but war was noisy. War was risky. War could kill the man doing it. Marriage did none of those things. Rudolph died, leaving something far more dangerous than territory. He left a method, a way to expand without appearing to move, a strategy that treated bloodlines as infrastructure. Every child became a claim waiting for the right funeral. Every union created a future argument that could be enforced without swords. This was not romance, it was asset management. Over generations, the House of Habsburg refined this technique until it became instinct. Others raised armies. The Habsburgs raised heirs. They let rivals exhaust themselves on battlefields while they waited in chapels. They did not need to win wars. They needed to outlive families. Europe began to change shape without noticing who was doing the shaping. This is where the paradox deepened. Because inheritance is not infinite, each marriage narrowed the pool. Each strategic union reduced variation. What began as expansion quietly became concentration. The same blood circulated through different titles. Cousins replaced strangers. Safety replaced curiosity. The dynasty mistook familiarity for strength. Faces began to change. At first, it was subtle. A prominent nose, a heavy lip, something painters softened with shadow. But portraits do not lie. They negotiate. Bone still pushes through flattery. Over time, the negotiation failed. The jaw advanced. The mouth refused alignment. Eating became labor. Speech slowed. The body struggled to keep up with the inheritance it carried. None of this registered as danger. Power insulated itself from feedback. Doctors were instructed. Pain was privatized. In a court where reality bent to protocol, biology was treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. The dynasty responded to fragility the only way it knew how. It closed ranks tighter, married inward, protected assets. The family tree stopped branching. It curled. By the time the Habsburg face became unmistakable, it was already too late to change course. The deformity was no longer cosmetic. It was systemic. The jaw was not a curse. It was evidence, a visible receipt for centuries of control that refused to circulate. This was the cost of building an empire without allowing loss, of mistaking continuity for immortality, of believing that power could be sealed like a vault without suffocating what was inside. The face that should not exist was never an accident. It was the logical outcome of a dynasty that treated history like property and blood like a contract. Long before the empire fractured on maps, it fractured in bone. And history, always patient, had begun collecting interest. Weakness, when chosen deliberately, has a way of misbehaving. It does not remain obedient. It studies the room. It listens. It waits for confidence to rot into carelessness. The men who believed they had selected a placeholder mistook poverty for stupidity and age for exhaustion. They confused the absence of spectacle with the absence of ambition. History rarely forgives that error. The Holy Roman Empire in the late 13th century was not governed so much as tolerated. It existed in fragments, a loose understanding that violence might someday answer to a crown if the crown ever returned. For decades it had not. The throne sat empty like an abandoned weapon, dangerous not because it was used, but because someone might remember how. During the Great Interregnum, law dissolved into muscle. Knights became bandits with letterhead. Bishops discovered the spiritual benefits of toll booths. Merchants traveled with ransoms pre-counted. In this ecosystem, chaos was not a problem. It was a business model. The 7 prince electors were its shareholders. They had no interest in reform. A strong emperor would mean audits. It would mean armies marching through private forests. It would mean questions. They wanted someone ornamental, a man whose authority would look impressive from a distance and evaporate up close, someone who could be crowned without being feared. Rudolf of Habsburg arrived at the table already misunderstood. He lacked the trappings of menace, no legendary victories, no gold to bribe consciences, no fashionable pedigree that made rivals nervous. He came from the Alpine margins, from a family that had survived rather than conquered. In a century that celebrated noise, he was quiet. That quiet was mistaken for emptiness. At 55, he was assumed to be near the end. In medieval arithmetic, age was destiny. Men who reached it were expected to cling to comfort, not reach for leverage. The electors assumed gratitude would tame him. Gratitude is an emotion. Power is not. Rudolf understood that immediately. He also understood something more subtle. Authority in the empire did not flow downward. It flowed sideways. It was negotiated, bartered, and performed. The crown was not a command. It was a stage. And Rudolf had spent his life watching men perform. He offered no reforms. He made no threats. He did not speak of restoring order or punishing excess. Those promises alarm people who profit from disorder. Instead, he spoke the language of kinship, of shared futures, of daughters and sons, of blood that would bind interests long after signatures faded. He turned politics into genealogy. One by one, objections softened. A vote against Rudolf became a vote against a future son-in-law. Neutrality became awkward. Opposition became personal. By the time the crown was placed on his head, it had already been woven into the private lives of the men who believed they controlled it. That was the first miscalculation. The second came quickly. Rudolf did not behave like a caretaker. He behaved like an owner. The crown was not symbolic to him. It was legal machinery. He invoked forgotten precedents, dusty clauses, imperial rights no one had enforced in decades because enforcement was inconvenient. He demanded restitution of lands improperly held. Most ignored him. One laughed. Ottokar of Bohemia was everything Rudolf was not. Young, rich, theatrically confident. His armor shone. His court glittered. He had taken Austria and Styria by force and saw no reason to justify success. To him, Rudolf was temporary, a paper emperor, an interruption. Rudolf did not challenge him with insults. He challenged him with law backed by coalition. He called in every minor noble Ottokar had ever humiliated, every lord who had lost a toll, every family pushed aside by Bohemian expansion. The army that formed was not impressive individually. Collectively, it was motivated. Resentment is a renewable resource. The battle that followed was not glorious. It was not meant to be. Rudolf hid a reserve. When it struck the flank, not the front. Chivalry was offended. Ottokar was surprised. Surprise kills faster than bravery. The Golden King died, stripped of his armor, anonymous in mud. Austria changed ownership in an afternoon. The electors watched this with unease. They had not hired a shepherd. They had installed a predator with manners. Too late to reverse course, they adjusted their expectations downward and hoped the damage would stop. It did not. Rudolf did not embark on endless conquest. He did not need to. He secured Austria as a hereditary possession, something the imperial crown alone could not guarantee. He was not interested in ruling forever. He was interested in ensuring his family did. That distinction mattered. It shifted the time horizon from reign to lineage. When Rudolf died, the empire did not collapse. That was the final proof of failure for the men who had chosen him. Weak emperors disappear without consequence. Rudolf left behind continuity. His sons inherited land, not just claims. His daughters sat in courts across the empire. The Habsburg name, once obscure, now appeared repeatedly in family trees that mattered. This was not domination by spectacle. It was domination by patience. A generation later, The dynasty had learned its lesson so thoroughly, it no longer questioned it. Why gamble lives when marriages outperformed armies? Why conquer when inheritance arrived pre-legitimized? Why expand outward when you could pull inward? The concept of weakness had inverted. Military restraint was no longer vulnerability. It was efficiency. The Habsburgs did not reject war. They demoted it. War became a last resort. Marriage became standard operating procedure. This strategy produced a quiet transformation. Europe began to feel owned rather than occupied. Borders shifted after funerals, not sieges. Children inherited crowns they had never seen. Languages changed at court without battles being fought. To outsiders, it looked like luck. Inside the dynasty, it looked like design. But design has limits. Every system optimized for control sacrifices resilience. Every shortcut around risk accumulates unseen cost. The Habsburgs were consolidating not just power, but themselves. Fewer families, fewer genetic variables. Familiarity became policy. The weakness they had once exploited began to turn inward. The dynasty mistook stability for immunity. The same instinct that had led the electors to choose a weak emperor now guided the family itself. Avoid disruption. Avoid outsiders. Avoid dilution. Preserve what exists at all costs. It is an understandable fear. Loss is louder than decay. By the time the cost became visible, it wore a human face. The nobody chosen to be weak had proven the strength of understatement. His descendants would prove the danger of taking that logic too far. Power that begins by surviving chaos often ends by fearing change, and fear, once institutionalized, rewrites the body. The Habsburgs had learned how to win without fighting. They had not yet learned how to stop winning. That lesson would arrive later, written not in treaties or titles, but in bone and breath. Victory teaches faster than defeat, and it teaches the wrong lessons first. Defeat invites reflection. Victory invites imitation. Once a system works, it becomes sacred, and sacred systems do not tolerate revision. The House of Habsburg did not merely win at Marchfeld. It learned how to avoid losing ever again. That distinction would define everything that followed. Rudolph's triumph was not the battle itself. Battles are loud, expensive, and unreliable. The real victory was discovering that the empire responded more predictably to paper than to steel. Law moved slower than cavalry, but it traveled farther. A claim, once legitimized, did not require feeding. It did not mutiny. It waited patiently for a vacancy and then stepped forward wearing ceremony. This was conquest with plausible deniability. The dynasty absorbed this lesson with religious devotion. Each generation refined it. Titles became commodities. Blood became currency. Children were no longer simply heirs. They were instruments calibrated for future leverage. A daughter married into a rival house was not leaving the family. She was being deployed behind enemy lines with a lifetime horizon. This required a different temperament than traditional kingship. Glory was inefficient. Spectacle attracted opposition. The Habsburgs learned to operate beneath notice, to let louder dynasties exhaust themselves performing dominance, while they quietly rewired inheritance. Their rise was not marked by banners, but by baptisms. Their victories were announced by funeral bells. Europe began to change shape without understanding why. A duke died unexpectedly. A marriage clause activated. A child inherited a crown in a language he did not speak. Courts scrambled to adjust protocol. Armies stood down because there was no one to fight. The transfer was legal. Resistance would be rebellion. Rebellion would be treason. Treason was expensive. This pattern repeated until it felt inevitable. The Habsburgs became specialists in inevitability. They positioned themselves so that every outcome benefited them regardless of intent. If peace held, they inherited slowly. If war erupted, their enemies weakened themselves. Either way, time worked for them. Time is the most reliable ally in politics, provided you can afford to wait. They could. What emerged was a dynasty optimized for longevity, not brilliance. Other houses burned hot and brief. The Habsburgs dimmed the lights and stayed open. They did not need heroes. Heroes died young. They needed administrators, survivors, and marriages that outlived resentment. Their court culture reflected this. Less passion, more procedure. Less romance, more documentation. This administrative instinct would later metastasize into paralysis, but at first it was revolutionary. The dynasty treated Europe as a ledger. Debts were tracked across generations. Offenses were remembered, but not avenged until profitable. Alliances were not emotional commitments. They were options, clauses, footnotes waiting for relevance. The language of war was replaced by the language of contracts. Borders became conditional. Sovereignty became negotiable. The map stopped being drawn with arrows and started being edited with annotations. The Habsburgs were not trying to dominate Europe in the traditional sense. They were trying to make domination obsolete. This worked because medieval politics assumed violence was the ultimate argument. The Habsburgs discovered that legitimacy could end arguments before they began. If you could claim something convincingly enough, force became unnecessary. Opponents found themselves legally isolated, morally cornered, or diplomatically embarrassed. Fighting looked vulgar when inheritance offered quiet surrender. But systems that reward patience also reward caution. Over time, the dynasty internalized a preference for certainty over possibility. Risk became distasteful. Novelty became suspect. Outsiders became variables rather than partners. The family's strategy demanded predictability, and predictability required control. Marriage choices narrowed. Suitable candidates came from fewer houses. Familiar blood felt safer. Shared ancestry simplified negotiations. Cultural alignment reduced friction. Each decision made sense locally. Each reduced complexity. Together they formed a funnel. The dynasty did not notice this narrowing because it still looked like expansion. Titles continued to accumulate. Territories grew. The family appeared everywhere. But appearance concealed repetition. The same genetic material circulated through different crowns. Diversity of power masked uniformity of blood. The method that had freed them from war began to lock them into themselves. This did not feel dangerous. It felt efficient. Familiarity reduced uncertainty. A cousin was known. A niece could be trusted. A foreign bride came with foreign priorities, foreign loyalties, foreign risks. The dynasty had been built by minimizing risk. It would not willingly introduce new ones. Here the lesson of winning hardened into doctrine. Success became proof of correctness. No one paused to ask whether the conditions that made the strategy effective were changing. Europe was stabilizing. States were centralizing. Armies were professionalizing. The old aristocratic chessboard was becoming a bureaucratic machine. But the Habsburgs continued playing the previous game, refining the move that had once outpaced everyone else. They doubled down. This doubling had consequences beyond genetics. It shaped the psychology of the family. Power became something to be preserved rather than exercised. Action became suspicious. Innovation felt dangerous. The dynasty trained itself to wait, to endure, to survive storms by closing shutters and trusting lineage. They mistook endurance for invulnerability. Portraits from this period tell the story better than chronicles. Faces lengthened. Expressions flattened. Joy disappeared. Children looked older than their parents. Bodies bore the quiet stress of expectation without release. The dynasty had become very good at not losing. It was less skilled at living. Meanwhile, rivals adapted. France learned to centralize aggressively. England experimented with institutions. The Ottomans expanded through disciplined militarization. These states took risks. They lost wars. They recovered. They evolved. The Habsburgs conserved. Conservation preserves, but it does not adapt. The dynasty's great advantage was time. Time is generous until it is not. When conditions change faster than inheritance cycles, patience becomes delay. Delay becomes decay. The Habsburgs did not yet feel this shift. Their coffers were full. Their titles were unmatched. Their strategy still delivered results. Winning once had taught them how to win forever. That belief would be their undoing, because history does not punish success. It punishes rigidity. The Habsburgs had turned a brilliant solution into an unquestionable identity. They no longer asked whether marriage should be the tool. It simply was. They no longer assessed whether concentration was dangerous. It felt safe. The dynasty had solved the problem of war and replaced it with a deeper problem it did not recognize: how to remain flexible while refusing to let go, how to circulate power without diluting it, how to rule the future when the future demanded change. Those questions were postponed. In their place came repetition. The method was passed down intact, unexamined, increasingly brittle. Winning once had taught them how to avoid loss. It had not taught them how to adapt to a world that no longer played by medieval rules. The machine was still running. The output was still impressive, but the inputs were narrowing. The dynasty was learning forever, but it was learning the same lesson again and again. And history, unimpressed, was already preparing the exam. A siege announces itself. Walls are surrounded. Supply lines are cut. Time is weaponized. Marriage, when used properly, achieves the same outcome without dust or corpses. It places an enemy under occupation while allowing them to believe they are still sovereign. The House of Habsburg perfected this quiet art until Europe was ringed not by armies, but by relatives. By the late 15th century, the dynasty no longer needed improvisation. The method was standardized. Identify a vulnerable inheritance. Insert a Habsburg spouse. Wait. The waiting mattered. Unlike war, marriage required patience, but rewarded certainty. Children matured. Rivals aged. Accidents happened. Dynasties failed to produce sons. When a throne went empty, the Habsburg claim was already inside the castle, eating at the table. This strategy thrived because medieval Europe was obsessed with legitimacy. Bloodlines mattered more than borders. A crown without a pedigree was a target. A pedigree without force could still command obedience. The Habsburgs offered legitimacy on credit. They did not seize thrones. They inherited them retroactively. Maximilian of Austria embodied this phase with theatrical efficiency. He did not conquer Burgundy. He married it. Mary of Burgundy brought with her the wealthiest urban network in Europe, cities that printed money and funded wars, trade routes that fed armies without raising swords. Maximilian acquired this not through bloodshed, but through vows spoken in a chapel. When Mary died young, crushed in a riding accident, the lands did not revert. They stayed. Marriage had done its work. This pattern repeated with alarming consistency. Spain followed Burgundy into the family portfolio. Ferdinand and Isabella had unified the Iberian kingdoms through war and faith. The Habsburgs unified them through grandchildren. A double wedding linked Austrian ambition with Spanish consolidation. The logic was flawless. Two power blocks merged. France was encircled. The future was secured. Except futures are fragile things. The cost of this strategy was invisibility. The Habsburgs did not look like conquerors. They looked like beneficiaries of good fortune. Death, not invasion, cleared their paths. Historians sometimes describe this as luck. It was not luck. It was design operating on a long enough timeline to resemble fate. Funerals replaced battles as the decisive events of the age. The most important military intelligence became birth records and health reports. Who was sick? Who had no sons? Who married late? The dynasty did not rush outcomes. It curated them. Europe adjusted to this new form of warfare slowly. Traditional powers continued investing in armies, mistaking visibility for effectiveness. The Habsburgs invested in midwives, lawyers, and notaries. Their victories arrived wrapped in black cloth, signed by witnesses. But siege engines work both ways. They apply pressure outward while concentrating resources inward. The Habsburg family expanded geographically while shrinking biologically. Each strategic marriage reduced variation. Each union tightened the circle. Outsiders became liabilities. Familiar blood became policy. At first, this did not alarm anyone. The family looked healthy enough. Children were born. Crowns multiplied. The empire reached a scale no sword could have carved. Charles of Thieves would later inherit a realm so vast it broke the imagination. The sun never set on his possessions, not because of genius, but because of marriage contracts signed decades earlier. But systems that reward inheritance over innovation produce a specific kind of ruler, one who receives rather than builds, one who manages rather than experiments. Charles inherited everything and understood nothing of how it had been assembled. He woke up inside a machine that required constant motion to avoid collapse. His education had prepared him to defend tradition, not to adapt it. The dynasty's reliance on marriage as a siege engine had quietly reprogrammed its expectations. Power was assumed to be permanent. Loss was treated as anomaly. Compromise felt unnecessary. This mindset hardened as success accumulated. The family began to behave as if history owed them continuity. The biological consequences followed the administrative logic. Marrying within the same circles reduced diplomatic friction. It also reduced genetic resilience. Traits repeated. Weaknesses aligned. The famous jaw was not a sudden mutation. It was a slow consensus reached by centuries of repetition. Painters adjusted. Courtiers pretended not to notice. Doctors offered rituals instead of solutions. The dynasty's public image remained immaculate while its private reality decayed. Siege engines do not concern themselves with the health of the besieged city. They only care that resistance ends. What made this particularly dangerous was how well it continued to work politically, even as it failed biologically. The Spanish branch, locked into endogamy, produced kings who struggled to speak and chew, yet ruled continents. The machine compensated. Bureaucracy expanded. Councils multiplied. Decisions slowed. Governance became ritualized to protect fragile rulers from consequence. This insulated the dynasty from immediate collapse. It also insulated it from feedback. No one could say stop. No one could suggest opening the circle without implying treason. The strategy that had delivered supremacy could not be questioned because questioning it would threaten everything it had secured. Marriage as siege engine demanded control. Control demanded purity. Purity demanded repetition. Repetition demanded isolation. The dynasty moved through these steps without debate because each solved the problem created by the last. It was elegant. It was fatal. Meanwhile, Europe changed. States centralized around institutions rather than blood. National identities hardened. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Credit systems outpaced inheritance. The Habsburgs noticed this too late. Their strategy had been optimized for a medieval world that was quietly expiring. The family responded not by adapting, but by entrenching. They married closer. They trusted fewer outsiders. They relied more heavily on protocol. When uncertainty rises, systems built on control tighten. They do not open. The siege engines continued to operate long after their usefulness declined. Marriages still occurred. Claims were still asserted. But the cost of maintaining legitimacy rose. The dynasty's rulers became symbols rather than actors. Their bodies bore the strain of representing permanence in a world accelerating toward change. The irony is that no dynasty in Europe was more cosmopolitan on paper. Their territories spanned languages, cultures, and continents. Yet no dynasty was more insular at its core. The Habsburgs married the world while refusing to let the world into themselves. This contradiction defined their peak. They owned Europe without understanding it. They ruled nations they had never seen. They spoke languages they did not use. They governed through layers of intermediaries who protected them from reality as effectively as castle walls once had. Sieges eventually end. Sometimes the city falls. Sometimes the attackers starve. Sometimes the structure being defended collapses from internal pressure. The Habsburgs did not notice the pressure building because the walls still stood. The banners still flew. The weddings still happened. But the siege engines had turned inward. What began as a brilliant solution to the chaos of medieval politics had become a self-sustaining machine incapable of stopping itself. Marriage no longer expanded power. It merely recycled it. The dynasty mistook motion for progress, continuity for health. Europe was being conquered quietly. The family was being exhausted silently. The walls had not yet cracked, but the city inside was already gasping. Inheritance is supposed to arrive gradually, like responsibility easing its way onto the shoulders. This one landed like an avalanche. A boy woke up to discover that the world had been quietly transferred into his name while he was still learning how to control his voice. There was no ceremony dramatic enough to prepare him for it, no education broad enough to explain it. The House of Habsburg had spent generations building a machine so efficient that when it finally delivered its masterpiece, it crushed. Charles was not born into conquest. He was born into accounting. His empire arrived not through victory parades, but through a cascade of funerals that no one bothered to mourn properly, because each death solved a logistical problem. Dynasties vanished. Succession lines collapsed. Claims converged. By the time Charles reached adolescence, the accumulation was complete. Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, Italy, the Americas. Oceans folded inward. Continents answered to a single nervous system that had not finished developing. This was not power in the heroic sense. It was administrati. The boy did not look the part. He stammered. He avoided crowds. His jaw already announced itself as a structural disagreement between ambition and anatomy. Portraits presented him with careful angles and forgiving shadows, but no amount of oil paint could hide the fact that the body carrying this inheritance was struggling to keep up. His mouth refused closure. His speech lagged behind his thoughts. His digestion betrayed him daily. This was the man chosen by God, according to doctrine, to shepherd Christendom. God, it seemed, had a taste for irony. The empire expected decisiveness. It received hesitation, not from weakness of will, but from excess of obligation. Every territory demanded attention. Every council insisted on precedence. Every border dispute arrived with a genealogical argument attached. Charles did not rule a country. He ruled an archive. The weight of accumulated legitimacy pressed down on him from every direction, and there was no way to redistribute it without breaking something sacred. He learned early that movement was mandatory. The empire could not be governed from a capital because it had too many centers. Charles lived on horseback, migrating from court to court like a traveling monarch, forced to keep plates spinning by never standing still. Spain demanded his presence. Germany demanded his authority. Italy demanded his money. The Netherlands demanded his tolerance. The New World demanded silver. The Pope demanded obedience. None of these demands canceled the others. They stacked. Physically, this was catastrophic. The jaw made eating an ordeal. Meals were private affairs conducted behind doors. Food was cut small and swallowed whole. Digestion punished him for it. Chronic pain became background noise. Gout followed, a familiar companion of rulers whose bodies failed under luxury and stress. Charles aged quickly, not in years, but in posture. His body folded inward while his empire stretched outward. Psychologically, the inheritance was worse. Charles had been raised to believe that unity was sacred, fragmentation was sin, compromise was weakness. These beliefs collided violently with reality. His territories did not share language, law, or priorities. They shared only his name. Every attempt to standardize provoked resistance. Every concession encouraged more demands. The empire behaved less like a body and more like a crowd. Rivals sensed this. France pressed from the west, resentful of encirclement. The Ottomans loomed from the east, uninterested in treaties or genealogy. And within the empire itself, a quieter threat emerged, one that could not be negotiated with marriages or armies. Ideas began to detach loyalty from blood. Faith fractured. Obedience became conditional. Charles was not built for abstraction. He was a practical inheritor of a theoretical empire. When Martin Luther refused to recant, Charles confronted a problem no siege engine could solve. You could execute a man. You could not execute a conviction already circulating faster than cavalry. The empire that had mastered inheritance discovered it had no defense against contagion of belief. This realization aged him more than any battle. He was expected to be everything at once: defender of the faith, arbiter of law, general of armies, banker of wars, father of nations that did not recognize each other as siblings. The corporate analogy writes itself. Charles was the chief executive of a conglomerate acquired through mergers no one had bothered to integrate. Each division resented the others. The balance sheets were impressive. The management was impossible. His rivals exploited this. Francis of France fought him not just with armies, but with posture. Francis embodied the Renaissance prince: confident, athletic, socially fluent. He understood that politics was theater. Charles understood that politics was obligation. Their rivalry was personal because it highlighted everything Charles lacked and everything he could not afford to become. When Francis was captured at Pavia, Charles did not celebrate. He hesitated. He released him under terms that evaporated immediately. Honor, in this environment, functioned as self-sabotage. The Ottomans were less forgiving. Their pressure exposed the limits of Charles's reach. Vienna held not because of imperial genius, but because weather intervened. Mud defeated what strategy could not. Charles absorbed this as another responsibility, narrowly survived, not as a warning about the fragility of his position. Survival reinforced the illusion of control. The empire compensated for his limitations, the way large systems always do. Councils multiplied. Advisors spoke for him. Decisions slowed. Bureaucracy thickened like scar tissue. This protected the ruler while alienating the ruled. Governance became ritualized to prevent catastrophic mistakes, but ritual resists adaptation. The machine could continue running only by increasing its own complexity. Charles felt this acutely. He was intelligent enough to recognize that the inheritance was unsustainable. He was devout enough to believe abandoning it would be a sin. He existed in permanent tension between what he had received and what he could realistically manage. The body mirrored the empire, overextended, inflamed, refusing to rest. Eventually, something had to give. Charles chose to fracture what he could not integrate. He divided the inheritance between branches of the family, believing this would preserve continuity while reducing strain. It was a rational decision. It was also the moment the dynasty crossed from expansion into recursion. The family would now turn inward more aggressively to keep the split inheritance aligned. But before that consequence fully emerged, Charles did something almost unthinkable. He stepped away. He abdicated. Not because he had lost, but because he could no longer sustain winning. He retreated into ritual and clocks, trying to impose order on time after failing to impose it on people. Even in retirement, the metaphor persisted. He could not make two mechanisms agree. He had tried to make continents obey. The boy who inherited everything became the man who surrendered it in pieces. His abdication was not defeat. It was triage, an admission that the machine his ancestors had built required more than one human to operate, and even that concession came too late to address the deeper flaw. The inheritance had outgrown biology. The dynasty had mistaken accumulation for stability. Charles embodied the moment when that error became visible. His body failed under the same logic that strained his empire. Concentration without circulation, control without release. He had inherited everything. What he could not inherit was the capacity to hold it indefinitely. History, again unimpressed, recorded this not as tragedy, but as process. An empire can be vast and still fragile if the body at its center is failing. Power does not dissolve all at once. It leaks. It seeps through joints, through gaps in stamina, through decisions delayed, until delay becomes policy. Charles ruled the world not from a throne, but from a collection of sick rooms, carriages, and temporary palaces, always in motion because stopping meant confronting the full inventory of what he could not fix. The jaw was not cosmetic. It was mechanical. Chewing exhausted him. Speaking humiliated him. Silence became a refuge. Advisors learned to fill it. The emperor nodded. Documents multiplied. The empire learned to operate around its ruler rather than through him. This was not abdication yet. It was accommodation. And accommodation is how systems decay while appearing stable. Physically, Charles was deteriorating faster than his calendar allowed. Gout inflamed his joints until walking felt punitive. Riding became agony. The saddle, once a symbol of authority, turned into a device of torture. He was carried instead, elevated above crowds that mistook elevation for dominance. Pain sharpened his temper but dulled his patience. Decisions slowed. When they came, they arrived already outdated. The empire did not wait. France pressed its claims with relentless persistence. Francis did not need to win decisively. He needed to keep Charles occupied. Every Italian campaign drained money, attention, and morale. Victories changed nothing. Losses mattered enormously. Charles learned that even success felt like attrition. Each campaign defended an idea of unity that reality increasingly ignored. In the East, the Ottomans represented something worse than rivalry. They represented asymmetry. They did not care about legitimacy. They did not respect inheritance. They moved with discipline, clarity, and momentum. When they crushed Hungary and appeared at Vienna's gates, it was not merely a military threat. It was a philosophical one. The empire built on contracts was being challenged by an empire built on command. Vienna survived by chance. Weather intervened where strategy failed. Mud swallowed artillery. Winter arrived early. Charles thanked Providence and moved on, interpreting survival as confirmation rather than warning. Empires rarely learn from escapes. They learn from collapses. This one was not ready. The deepest fracture came from within. Faith had been the glue holding the inheritance together. Catholicism was not just belief, it was administrative infrastructure. It legitimized rule. It justified obedience. When Martin Luther refused to recant, Charles faced an opponent immune to siege engines. You could not marry an idea. You could not inherit a conviction. Burning a man only amplified his words. The diet of worms exposed the limits of imperial theater. Velvet and gold confronted wool and certainty. Charles ordered submission and received refusal. In that moment, something irreversible happened. Authority blinked. The empire discovered it could not compel belief. Once that door opened, it never closed. Charles responded the only way he knew how. He compartmentalized. Wars abroad, councils at home, delegation everywhere. The imperial court became a relay race of paperwork. Decisions moved through layers of intermediaries designed to protect the emperor from overload. This preserved the ruler. It eroded responsiveness. Governance hardened into ritual because ritual does not argue back. The sack of Rome was the grotesque culmination of this fragmentation. An unpaid imperial army, religiously divided and financially abandoned, turned on the city it was meant to protect. Rome fell not because Charles ordered it, but because his system could not prevent it. The emperor of Christendom watched his own soldiers desecrate its heart. The pope fled. Art was mutilated. Sanctity was auctioned. Charles mourned publicly. Privately, he recognized leverage. A free pope was a nuisance. A captive pope was useful. This was the moment the empire crossed a line it could not uncross. Power stopped pretending to be moral authority and accepted itself as management. Faith became negotiable. Principle became tactical. Charles did not celebrate this shift. He endured it. Endurance was his defining trait. It was also his prison. The physical toll escalated. His jaw caused constant pain. His digestion failed. His body swelled. Gout immobilized him. He was carried like a relic while still alive. The image was fitting. The empire he ruled was becoming something to be venerated rather than used. It inspired awe and resentment in equal measure, neither of which translated into cooperation. By his mid-50s, Charles looked ancient, not wise, spent. He had spent 4 decades chasing crises he did not create, defending systems he did not design, and preserving an inheritance that refused to stabilize. The body could not keep pace. Neither could the empire. The decision to abdicate arrived quietly. No coup, no defeat, just exhaustion formalized. Charles gathered his titles and distributed them like a surgeon attempting to save a patient by separating organs. Austria and the imperial crown went one way. Spain and the overseas empire went another. This division was presented as rational. It was. It was also an admission that the machine required more than one operator and still might fail. The abdication ceremony was theater without triumph. Charles wept. He leaned on William of Orange, a man who would later dismantle much of what Charles was surrendering. History delights in such staging. The emperor did not notice. He was already elsewhere, retreating into ritual, clocks, and monasteries. In retirement, Charles attempted to impose order on time. He collected clocks obsessively, trying to synchronize mechanisms that refused agreement. Gears slipped. Chimes misaligned. The metaphor was obvious to everyone except the man trapped inside it. He had tried to force continents into harmony and failed. 2 clocks proved equally stubborn. The final indignity was banal. A mosquito ended what armies could not. Charles died not in battle, not on a throne, but in a quiet room, clutching a simple cross. The empire continued without him, fragmented but intact. His body, finally relieved, stopped. Ruling the world while falling apart had been possible because the system compensated for weakness. Councils filled gaps. Bureaucracy absorbed shock. Ritual masked decay. But compensation is not cure. It delays collapse while increasing dependency. Charles left behind an empire that functioned only because it had learned to function without its ruler. This was the legacy of concentration. Power had grown so vast, it could no longer be directed by a single will. Biology had failed under the same strain. The emperor's body and his empire shared a diagnosis: chronic overload, progressive failure, temporary stabilization through complexity. Charles did not cause this. He revealed it. The dynasty would respond by tightening control, doubling down on the methods that had delivered inheritance in the first place. Marriage would become closer. Trust would narrow. Purity would be enforced. The split inheritance would demand reunification through blood rather than reform. The world Charles ruled survived him. The conditions that sustained it did not. His reign marked the transition from expansion to maintenance, from conquest to conservation, from ambition to anxiety. He had ruled the world while falling apart because the system allowed it. It would not always. History rarely repeats mistakes exactly. It refines them. The next generation would inherit not just territories, but a precedent, that a broken body could still rule, that exhaustion could be managed, that collapse could be postponed. Postponement is not prevention. The empire moved forward carrying the weight of this lesson, unaware that each accommodation brought the invoice closer to being due. Control feels responsible when chaos is expensive. It feels moral when uncertainty threatens collapse. And it feels irresistible when the person exercising it believes that without their constant supervision, the entire structure will simply fall over. Micromanagement is rarely born from arrogance. It is born from fear, dressed up as diligence. In the Habsburg world, fear had become policy. Philip inherited the Spanish half of the machine at the precise moment it stopped tolerating human scale. His father had ruled by movement, riding the empire like a shock absorber, distributing stress through motion. Philip ruled by stillness. He did not travel because travel created variables. He did not delegate because delegation diluted certainty. He did not trust time because time had betrayed his father. So he attempted the impossible. He tried to rule the world from a desk. The desk was in a granite monastery palace that looked less like a residence than a warning. Cold, severe, intentionally joyless. It was designed to suppress distraction and amplify seriousness. Philip did not want to be loved. He wanted to be correct. Every decision passed through his hands. Every letter waited for his eyes. Every request stalled until it conformed to his sense of order. The empire slowed to his heartbeat. At first, this seemed virtuous. He worked relentlessly. He read everything. He corrected spelling errors in reports from generals while their soldiers starved. He believed attention was governance, that if he could just see enough, understand enough, sign enough, nothing would go wrong. This is how large systems convince themselves they are safe. They mistake oversight for control and control for competence. The problem was scale. The empire Philip managed was fueled by silver extracted from mountains that consumed men by the thousands. That silver crossed oceans, passed through bankers, paid mercenaries, and vanished into wars that never ended. Spain looked rich because money passed through it constantly. It was not rich. It was a funnel. Inflation followed the silver like a shadow. Prices rose. Wages lagged. Bread became expensive. Discontent simmered. Philip responded with paperwork. He authorized fleets, approved supply lists, and monitored prayer schedules. He believed logistics could substitute for strategy. But logistics without adaptability become ritual. When storms scattered the armada, Philip had calculated everything except weather. When decisions arrived late, he blamed messengers. When revolts broke out, he blamed heresy. When debts mounted, he blamed bankers. He never blamed the system that required one man to approve the movement of continents. The Spanish Armada was the purest expression of micromanagement as ideology. Every plank was accounted for. Every ration was measured. Every prayer was scheduled. The plan was flawless on paper. At sea, it disintegrated. Smaller ships moved faster. Weather ignored documentation. Delay multiplied error. When the fleet failed, Philip responded with calm resignation. He had sent ships against men, not elements. It was a reasonable statement. It was also an admission that reason had limits. Meanwhile, the biological cost of dynastic control accelerated. Philip married inward. His successors followed suit. The family tree tightened like a noose. Children were born sickly. Many did not survive. Those who did struggled. The jaw grew heavier. Speech slurred, bodies weakened. The empire compensated by adding layers. Councils multiplied. Authority diffused downward, while responsibility remained concentrated at the top. This produced paralysis. Decisions took months. By the time orders arrived, conditions had changed. Governors improvised. Improvisation created inconsistency. Inconsistency provoked intervention from the center. The cycle fed itself. The more control Philip demanded, the less effective the empire became. The less effective it became, the more control he demanded. Micromanagement is not static. It escalates. The Dutch provinces felt this first. Their cities were wealthy, educated, and accustomed to autonomy. Philip treated their demands like paperwork errors. He responded with edicts and repression. When revolt followed, he escalated force. War dragged on for decades. It drained money, attention, and credibility. The empire could afford war. It could not afford endless war, managed by a man unwilling to adapt. Bankruptcy followed. Not once. Repeatedly. The richest empire in the world defaulted on its debts with ritual regularity. Creditors adjusted. Interest rose. Trust evaporated. The system survived because it was large enough to fail slowly. That was not resilience. It was inertia. At court, Philip became spectral. He trusted paper more than people. He isolated himself inside process. He believed time was an ally because he worked harder than anyone else. Time was not impressed. While he reviewed documents, rivals experimented. While he preserved orthodoxy, enemies modernized. While he enforced purity, his dynasty weakened. The irony was complete. The family that had conquered Europe by avoiding war was now trapped in permanent war because it refused flexibility. The method that had delivered inheritance now demanded control. Control demanded purity. Purity produced fragility. Fragility required more control. By the time Philip died, Spain still appeared dominant. Its fleets crossed oceans. Its banners flew across continents. But the structure beneath the spectacle was hollowing out. Money moved faster than authority. Ideas moved faster than armies. Biology moved slower than inheritance. Micromanagement had not caused immediate collapse. It had guaranteed eventual failure. The empire had become a machine that could not tolerate absence and could not function under presence. Every decision depended on a center that was overwhelmed by its own necessity. The dynasty had confused vigilance with wisdom. It had mistaken supervision for strength, and in doing so, it had taught itself the most dangerous lesson of all. That power survives by never letting go. History was preparing to demonstrate the opposite. Fear is an efficient architect. It simplifies choices, narrows options, and persuades intelligent people to do reckless things in the name of safety. By the time the House of Habsburg began turning its bloodlines inward, it no longer felt like a strategy. It felt like self-defense. The world beyond the family had become unpredictable. Enemies multiplied. Faith fractured. Revolts spread. Trust, once extended through marriage, now looked like leakage. So the dynasty did what frightened systems always do. It sealed itself. This was not presented as desperation. It was framed as prudence. Outsiders brought uncertainty. Foreign brides arrived with foreign loyalties. New blood meant new interests, new alliances, new risks. The Habsburgs had spent centuries eliminating variables. Why reintroduce them now when the stakes were higher than ever? Familiar blood felt reliable. Cousins understood protocol. Nieces could be managed. Uncles could be trusted. The family convinced itself that proximity was stability. Biology disagreed, quietly at first. The family tree, once expansive, began to fold back on itself. Marriages that would have scandalized earlier generations became routine. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. The language of these unions remained ceremonial, but their logic was mathematical. Keep the inheritance aligned, prevent fragmentation, avoid dilution. The dynasty treated genes the way it treated territory, as assets that could not be allowed to drift. Each generation justified the last. The children still wore crowns. The empire still functioned. Any discomfort could be managed by doctors, priests, or painters. Portraits softened angles. Clergy reframed weakness as divine mystery. The court learned to look away. When a child died young, it was tragedy, not data. When another survived but struggled, it was a test of faith. The repetition continued. Genetic concentration does not announce itself with catastrophe. It accumulates. Traits align. Recessive weaknesses surface. Immune systems falter. Development slows. The famous jaw advanced incrementally, generation by generation, like a shoreline eroding under constant pressure. What had once been a family resemblance hardened into a deformity. Speech became difficult. Chewing became labor. Digestion failed. Seizures appeared. Fertility declined. Infant mortality rose. In an age without genetics, these patterns were interpreted morally. God was displeased. Witches were blamed. Exorcisms replaced medicine. The dynasty addressed biological failure with ritual because ritual preserved hierarchy. The court normalized dysfunction. Kings who could barely speak were shielded by councils. Queens who could not conceive were pressured until their bodies broke. Children were raised like porcelain, guarded obsessively, educated minimally, expected to inherit more than they could metabolize. The system adapted to weakness by surrounding it with procedure. This allowed power to continue while the body failed. The Spanish branch reached the extreme first. Its isolation was absolute. Its marriage pool microscopic. The inbreeding coefficient climbed silently beyond what any single incestuous union would produce. Centuries of calculated closeness achieved what no one intended. A dynasty biologically more fragile than if it had openly violated every taboo at once. The irony was brutal. The family had married inward to prevent extinction. The result was extinction delayed, not avoided. Meanwhile, the logic spread. The Austrian branch watched and learned the wrong lesson. The problem was not purity itself, they concluded, but imbalance. The solution was careful repetition. Control the unions. Monitor outcomes. Adjust slowly. They believed management could solve biology. It could not. As bodies weakened, governance hardened. Protocol multiplied. Every weakness required a rule to conceal it. Every limitation demanded an accommodation. The dynasty became more rigid precisely as it became more fragile. Change felt dangerous because the structure could not absorb shock. Adaptation risked exposure. The wreath tightened. A wreath is decorative. It is circular. It has no beginning and no end. It looks complete. But it is also a closed system. Nothing enters, nothing leaves. Over time, what it preserves dries out. The Habsburg family tree stopped growing upward. It coiled inward, strangling itself while maintaining perfect symmetry. This biological contraction mirrored the political one. The dynasty no longer expanded meaningfully. It defended. It preserved. It froze. Enemies evolved. States modernized. Armies professionalized. National identities formed. The Habsburgs responded with tradition and paperwork. Their rulers became symbols of continuity rather than agents of change. By the late 17th century, the consequences were undeniable. The Spanish court resembled a hospital ward. Physicians documented symptoms they could not explain. Priests competed to cure what doctors could not. The king became a patient. The empire became a caretaker. Yet the system persisted. It always does. Weakness alone does not topple power. What topples power is the refusal to acknowledge weakness as information. The Habsburgs saw fragility and responded with denial. They doubled down on purity. They tightened marriages further. They trusted blood over competence. This produced the dynasty's most horrifying figure, not a tyrant, not a conqueror, a victim, a king whose body would become the final argument against the strategy that created him. By the time he was born, the wreath had closed completely. There was nowhere left to turn. No outsider could be trusted. No reform could be attempted without unraveling everything the family believed itself to be. The bloodline had become a monument to its own fear. History did not intervene. It did not need to. Biology had already taken over. The dynasty had converted power into inheritance, inheritance into purity, and purity into fragility. The process was elegant. It was inevitable. It was terminal. The wreath was complete. He was born into silence, thick with relief and dread. Bells rang. Cannons fired. Courtiers smiled too hard. The dynasty had produced what it believed was salvation, a male heir to a throne that could not imagine itself ending. Yet inside the nursery, something was already wrong in ways that ceremony could not correct. The body in the cradle did not look like continuity. It looked like evidence. Charles was not weak in the ordinary sense. Weakness implies potential unrealized. He was incomplete. His skull was oversized, his limbs unreliable, his skin prone to eruptions that alarmed physicians trained to hide alarm. His jaw, the family signature, had reached a grotesque clarity. It no longer suggested lineage. It declared it. Teeth failed to meet. The mouth remained open, as if even his own body refused closure. This was not a king shaped by power. This was power stripped of discretion. He did not develop normally. Speech arrived late and never fully organized itself. Words leaked out wet and indistinct, a problem not of intelligence, but of mechanics. His tongue overwhelmed the space meant to contain it. Drool followed him like an accusation. Walking came years after it should have, tentative and painful, as if gravity itself doubted his right to stand. For most of his childhood, he was carried, displayed rather than moved. The court adapted instantly. It always did. Weakness was reclassified as mystery. Doctors spoke in euphemisms. Priests offered explanations that preserved hierarchy. The king was not broken. He was afflicted. He was not failing. He was bewitched. This framing mattered. A curse could be endured. Biology could not be negotiated with. Eating was an ordeal. Chewing was impossible. Food was softened, cut small, swallowed whole. Digestion punished him for it with constant pain, vomiting, and exhaustion. Hunger lingered without satisfaction. The King of Spain, ruler of the Indies, could not process a meal without assistance. The symbolism was obvious. No one commented. As he aged, the symptoms multiplied. Seizures, hallucinations, periods of lethargy punctuated by confusion. His immune system collapsed under minor infections. Childhood illnesses lingered like threats. Survival became an achievement rather than an expectation. Each birthday was celebrated as proof of divine favor rather than medical improbability. Governance adjusted accordingly. Councils ruled. Favorites whispered. Decisions were staged around the king's limited capacity. Documents were simplified. Audiences shortened. Authority became performative. Charles appeared, nodded, withdrew. The machinery of empire moved without him, using his presence as justification rather than direction. This did not destabilize Spain immediately. Empires are resilient in their final phase. They compensate. They automate. They ritualize. The Spanish state continued extracting silver, raising armies, enforcing decrees. The problem was not collapse, it was drift. Policy lacked coherence. Strategy dissolved into reaction. Long-term planning became impossible when the sovereign could not sustain attention long enough to comprehend consequence. The court searched for solutions that preserved the fiction of control. Medicine failed. Religion escalated. Exorcisms were performed. Relics applied. Saints consulted. Concoctions brewed from venom, bone, and prayer were forced down a body already struggling to function. The king endured it all passively. He had learned early that resistance was pointless. His life was not his own. It belonged to the dynasty that had manufactured him. Marriage was attempted. Not once, twice. The first union produced no heirs. The second did not either. Fertility had become another casualty of the wreath. The dynasty watched anxiously as years passed without succession. Europe waited with barely concealed hunger. Treaties were drafted around the expectation of his death. Maps were redrawn in advance. The king lived inside a countdown that everyone else could see. He understood this dimly, not in political terms, but emotionally. He knew he was watched. He knew he was discussed. He sensed the impatience. The court spoke around him, not to him. Laughter stopped when he entered rooms. Pity is louder than mockery. He absorbed it silently, yet he did not die quickly. That was the final insult to expectation. He survived measles, smallpox, fevers that should have ended him. He outlived predictions with stubborn persistence. This extended the agony. Spain existed in permanent suspense, unable to plan for continuity, unable to move forward, unable to let go. When death finally came, it arrived without drama. The body simply stopped. Relief followed grief, then curiosity. Physicians performed an autopsy to explain what faith could not. What they found was less explanation than indictment. A heart unnaturally small, lungs corroded, intestines decayed, organs malformed. A body that had been alive by effort rather than design. The report read like an inventory of neglect, the final confirmation that this was not sorcery. It was arithmetic. Generations of inward turning had produced a king whose body could not sustain the weight of a crown because it could not sustain itself. With his death, the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg ended, not overthrown, not conquered, extinguished. The largest empire on earth found itself without a legitimate heir because legitimacy had been hoarded too carefully. The dynasty that feared dilution had achieved disappearance. The war that followed was inevitable. When a structure collapses inward, everything around it rushes to fill the space. Europe tore itself apart over the Spanish inheritance, fighting over what the Habsburgs could no longer hold. The irony was complete. Centuries of careful control ended in uncontrolled violence. The king who could not function was not a failure of character. He was the logical endpoint of a system that valued continuity over vitality. He did not break the dynasty. He revealed it. His body told the truth that policy had concealed. The Habsburgs had mistaken survival for success. They had treated reproduction as strategy rather than biology. They had believed that power could be preserved by sealing it off from change. The result lay on a marble table, measured and catalogued. History did not judge him harshly. It did not need to. His existence was judgment enough. He was not a monster. He was a warning. The Spanish branch vanished quietly, leaving behind empty palaces and unresolved claims. The Austrian branch watched, took notes, and reassured itself that it would be different, that moderation would save it, that management could succeed where extremity had failed. It was wrong. The king who could not function closed one chapter. He did not end the story. He simply demonstrated the price of believing that inheritance is stronger than life. The dynasty would continue elsewhere, older, wiser, and no less trapped by its own logic. Collapse creates opportunity only for those willing to accept responsibility without sentiment. When the Spanish branch extinguished itself, the House of Habsburg did not mourn publicly for long. Mourning is a luxury of secure systems. In Vienna, Survival demanded motion. What remained of the dynasty faced a different threat, not decay of blood, but evaporation of authority. The machine still existed, but it had lost pressure. Someone had to rebuild it before Europe finished dismantling it by consensus. That someone was Maria Theresa. She did not arrive as a conqueror. She arrived as a problem, a woman in a system designed to pretend women were invisible, a ruler in a legal structure that technically forbade her existence. The Salic logic of inheritance had no slot for her, and Europe noticed immediately. Treaties were reinterpreted, promises dissolved, armies mobilized with professional indifference. The message was clear. Her legitimacy would be tested not in court, but on the battlefield. Maria Theresa understood this faster than anyone expected. She did not waste time arguing theology or precedent. She appealed to something older and more reliable: fear, loyalty, shame. When she appeared before the Hungarian nobility holding her infant son, she did not threaten them. She reminded them who would inherit the ruins if she failed. Emotion did what law could not. Men pledged swords to a woman they had intended to dismember politically days earlier. But speeches do not rebuild states. Money does. Maria Theresa inherited an empire with an empty treasury, a bloated aristocracy, and an army that existed mostly on paper. The old Habsburg instinct would have been to negotiate exemptions, preserve privilege, and avoid confrontation. She did the opposite. She taxed the untaxable. Nobles paid. Clergy paid. When they protested, she gestured toward Prussian artillery and asked them which humiliation they preferred. The machine restarted. Revenue stabilized. The army was rebuilt from the bottom up. Titles stopped guaranteeing rank. Competence replaced pedigree. Officers learned discipline. Logistics improved. The state began to function like a state rather than a collection of inherited habits. Maria Theresa was not interested in elegance. She was interested in survival. Reform was not philosophical, it was operational. Centralization followed. Local privileges were dismantled methodically. Laws standardized. Bureaucracy expanded. Vienna became the nerve center of an empire that had previously operated like a loose confederation of resentments. Paperwork multiplied, but this time it moved faster than fear. Administration replaced improvisation. For the first time, the Habsburg state could respond coherently to crisis. Maria Theresa worked relentlessly. Dawn began at her desk. Reports arrived constantly. She read them all, not because she feared losing control, but because she believed attention was obligation. This distinguished her from Philip. Her micromanagement did not paralyze, it disciplined. She delegated authority while retaining accountability. The difference mattered. Her husband, Francis Stephen, understood money. He invested quietly. Manufactures expanded. State contracts stabilized supply. The dynasty regained solvency, not through silver, but through industry. This was unglamorous power. It lasted. Yet rebuilding the machine was only half the project. The other half was biological. Maria Theresa treated her body as infrastructure. 16 pregnancies in 19 years. Children arrived with strategic regularity. Each birth was an asset. Each survival a reinforcement. The dynasty had lost Spain because it could not reproduce itself. She would not repeat that error. Her children were educated, monitored, and deployed. Love existed, but it was secondary to function. Marriage returned as a tool, but now wielded with awareness of its cost. She avoided the extreme inward turning of the Spanish branch. Outsiders were permitted selectively. Balance replaced purity. The family tree expanded again, cautiously, under supervision. The wreath loosened, but did not open fully. This did not make her gentle. She governed morality with the same efficiency she applied to finance. The state policed behavior. Sexuality was regulated. Dissent was contained. Enlightenment ideas were filtered. Culture was encouraged as decoration, not disruption. Vienna became beautiful and suffocating simultaneously. Music flourished. Thought was monitored. She built palaces not for pleasure, but for management. Schönbrunn was a factory of governance filled with children, clerks, and directives. It symbolized her rule perfectly: order over indulgence, structure over spontaneity. She did not seek admiration. She sought durability. By the end of her reign, the Habsburg machine functioned again. The empire was solvent, the army competent, the bureaucracy disciplined, the dynasty populated. She had done what no one else could. She had reversed decline through force of will and refusal to indulge nostalgia. But she had also frozen the system at the moment of recovery. Her reforms stabilized the empire, but did not prepare it for ideological change. She distrusted experimentation. She suppressed Enlightenment currents rather than integrating them. Her son Joseph would try to undo this rigidity and fail. The machine she rebuilt was strong, but brittle. It could withstand pressure. It could not bend. Maria Theresa saved the dynasty by turning it into something closer to a modern state. She also ensured that when change arrived faster than bureaucracy could absorb, the structure would crack rather than adapt. She rebuilt the machine with extraordinary discipline. She did not redesign its purpose. History respects this kind of achievement without forgiving its limitations. The dynasty survived her. The world she stabilized did not. The mother who rebuilt the machine succeeded completely at the task she set herself. The tragedy was that the task itself was already outdated. Stability is seductive because it feels like wisdom. When chaos recedes and borders stop bleeding, the human instinct is to preserve the moment that worked. Maria Theresa had rebuilt the Habsburg machine so thoroughly that her successors mistook survival for solution. The empire no longer appeared sick, it appeared calm. And calm, to a dynasty traumatized by collapse, felt like proof of correctness. What followed was not decay, but preservation taken too far. The empire entered its age of formaldehyde. Structures hardened. Procedures became sacred. Reform shifted from necessity to threat. The state continued to function, but only within the parameters Maria Theresa had defined. Those parameters were efficient for an 18th century world that valued order, hierarchy, and obedience. The problem was that the world did not freeze when she did. Ideas accelerated. Economies shifted. National identities crystallized. The Habsburg response was to tighten protocol and call it continuity. Joseph II tried to introduce motion. He dismantled monasteries, loosened censorship, challenged privilege, and attempted to rationalize governance across cultures. The machine resisted him. Nobility revolted. Clergy obstructed. Provinces ignored decrees. Reform without consent created friction rather than flow. When he died exhausted and disappointed, the lesson absorbed by the dynasty was not that reform required adaptation. It was that reform itself was dangerous. So they chose immobility. The empire perfected administration while neglecting legitimacy. It built railways and maintained armies, but failed to address the emotional reality of its subjects. Dozens of languages echoed through a bureaucracy that insisted on uniformity. Identity was treated as inconvenience. Nationalism was viewed as childish ingratitude. The state responded with paperwork. Vienna flourished culturally. Music, architecture, etiquette, and spectacle filled the vacuum left by a political stagnation. The waltz became the rhythm of avoidance. Coffee houses became safe spaces where ideas could circulate without consequence. Freud explored the subconscious because the conscious was regulated. Art thrived because power preferred beauty to argument. The emperor embodied this contradiction. Franz Joseph ruled longer than anyone alive remembered beginnings. He was tradition made flesh. His routines never changed. His desk never moved. His handwriting aged but did not adapt. He did not rule aggressively. He endured. Every innovation passed him like weather. He believed his duty was to preserve the state exactly as he had received it, ignoring the fact that he had inherited something already obsolete. Tragedy hollowed him out personally, but reinforced his rigidity politically. Loss made him cautious. Caution became paralysis. When compromises were forced upon him, such as the dual monarchy, they solved immediate crises while deepening structural incoherence. Two governments, two parliaments, one aging emperor pretending unity could be maintained by habit. The empire became a museum that people lived inside. Its borders contained unresolved contradictions frozen in place. Ethnic tensions were suppressed, not addressed. Autonomy was delayed, not negotiated. The system survived by exhausting its subjects rather than inspiring them. Loyalty persisted out of inertia, not belief. This is the danger of preservation without renewal. Formaldehyde stops decay, but it also stops growth. The Habsburg state maintained order at the cost of flexibility. When shocks arrived, they did not bend the structure. They shattered it. The assassination that triggered the final collapse did not create instability. It revealed it. The war that followed did not destroy the empire. It simply removed the last excuse for pretending it still functioned. When the structure dissolved, it did so instantly, as preserved things often do once exposed to air. The empire had been alive long after it stopped evolving. It mistook longevity for relevance. By the time it recognized the difference, history had already moved on. Formaldehyde preserved the body, not the future. Old age does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. It settles into routine. It teaches endurance without renewal and mistakes persistence for purpose. By the time the House of Habsburg reached its final chapter, it was no longer struggling against enemies. It was outlasting itself. The dynasty had become ancient in posture, reflex, and imagination, still standing only because no one had yet pushed hard enough to notice it was hollow. Franz Joseph was the perfect ending. He had ruled for so long that memory bent around him. Revolutions rose and fell. Empires were renamed. Technologies rewired daily life. He remained, not dynamic, not visionary, present. His authority came not from innovation, but from duration. People obeyed him the way one obeys gravity, not because it is inspiring, but because it has always been there. He woke before dawn, slept on iron, worked until exhaustion, refused telephones, rejected automobiles, distrusted typewriters. Progress felt vulgar to him, an unnecessary complication layered atop systems that already worked well enough to endure. He believed history rewarded discipline. It does not. It rewards adaptation. Discipline merely delays consequences. His private life collapsed methodically. A brother executed abroad, a son dead by his own hand, a wife murdered in public. Each loss removed another emotional ligament. What remained was duty stripped of comfort. The emperor did not grieve publicly for long. He returned to his desk. Files required signatures. The state required continuity. Personal devastation became another inconvenience to manage. This stoicism impressed contemporaries. It should have alarmed them. With no heir he trusted and no vision he believed in, Franz Joseph presided over a system that functioned only because it avoided decision. When forced to choose, it compromised. When compromise failed, it deferred. When deferral became impossible, it froze. The empire learned to survive crises by refusing to resolve them. Then came the assassination. It was absurd in its mechanics. A wrong turn, a stalled engine, a young man with a weapon too small for the consequences it unleashed. The Archduke died, not as a symbol of stability, but as a reminder of how brittle ritual becomes when confronted by contingency. Franz Joseph's response was not grief, It was relief disguised as fatalism. Order, he believed, had been restored by forces beyond him. That belief was the final illusion. When war was declared, it was not declared with enthusiasm. It was declared with resignation, a punitive action, a limited response, a bureaucratic decision signed by a hand that had signed thousands like it. The dynasty believed it was initiating another manageable crisis. Instead, it activated every unresolved tension it had preserved for decades. Alliances snapped tight, mobilizations cascaded. The empire that had survived by delay was forced into immediacy. Its internal contradictions surfaced at once. Languages collided, loyalties fractured, command chains tangled. The formaldehyde evaporated. Franz Joseph lived just long enough to watch the illusion fail. He died before the end, sparing himself the sight of the map dissolving. His successor inherited not a throne, but an evacuation plan. When the empire collapsed, it did not resist. It simply stopped. Governments declared independence. Armies disbanded. Subjects withdrew consent without ceremony. The Habsburgs did not fall in a revolution. They were dismissed. After 6 centuries, the dynasty exited through paperwork, a signature releasing subjects from loyalty. No last stand, no exile dramatics. The family walked out of palaces they had outgrown, leaving behind buildings too large for belief and rituals too heavy for meaning. What remained was legacy. Central Europe inherited borders drawn by administrative convenience rather than cultural coherence. Ethnic tensions froze and thawed repeatedly, each cycle echoing the unresolved compromises of imperial rule. Vienna retained beauty but lost authority. Culture survived where politics failed. Music outlived monarchy. Psychology flourished where repression had once ruled. The Habsburgs left behind atmosphere rather than instruction, a way of being old before being obsolete, a habit of preservation without purpose. They demonstrated that power can persist long after it has stopped justifying itself. Their greatest mistake was not inbreeding. It was believing that continuity is the same as immortality. The jaw was only a symbol. The true curse was structural, a refusal to accept that systems must either change or end. The Habsburgs chose neither. They tried to pause history. History waited politely, then moved on without them. In the end, the dynasty did not lose to a stronger enemy, a better ideology, or a superior strategy. It lost to time because it believed time could be managed like territory, regulated like marriage, and contained like blood. It could not. The long goodbye was quiet, administrative, and final. No catastrophe, no redemption, just the steady withdrawal of relevance until nothing remained but memory and architecture. Power does not vanish when it is defeated. It vanishes when it becomes convinced it will last forever. The House of Habsburg ruled Europe longer than any dynasty had a right to expect. It married the world. It tried to preserve itself against entropy, and in doing so, it taught the simplest lesson history offers and humanity keeps ignoring. Survival is not success. Duration is not destiny. And permanence is the most fragile ambition of all.